Hello, welcome to the Sideboard here at the Star City Games Players Championship, brought to you by Ultimate Garden Carnox Chairs. I'm Nick Miller alongside our three-time Open champion this year, Dom Harvey. How you doing?
Not too bad, not too bad.
You were sweating the PC all year despite being the one just crushing all of the Opens and top 8 wins. You're here now. How are you feeling?
Yeah, it was down to the wire. I was facing the prospect of winning 3 Opens in a year and still missing, which would be one for the record books, but not really in the way I wanted. So luckily, making 0 records this weekend, just here, turning up, competing, hopefully having a good time.
Tying a record with Open wins in a year, so that's nice.
Sure.
We're talking about Modern today with you, and this is a format you have just been all over the format with throughout the year.
Yeah.
From early builds of KCI with Thopter Sword, to Urza, to you name it. You have played it in this format. You have Tron wins. Today, though, you're playing a different kind of big mana strategy, playing the Mountain deck. Valakut, we're playing Titanshift. How did you end up on this deck?
Yeah, we got lots of actual mountains and then some mountains just in there for good measure. So the big mana decks have kind of been my wheelhouse in Modern for a long time. So Amulet, Tron, and a few others. This one I thought was well positioned for this weekend, even though on the whole, I think the format has kind of passed it by, where it's quite hard for this deck to gain new things from recent sets, where R&D is not in the business of printing 2-mana ramp cards anymore, for instance. And they're a little gun shy about effects that find multiple lands, or the kind of cards that you would want in a strategy like this. But I thought for this tournament, where you have 16 players, and because of the way that people test it, the format tries to out-level itself over and over again. And so decks that might be a risky choice for, let's say, an Open or a Grand Prix or a wider field might be a smart level 2 or level 3 or level N+1 choice for the field you're expecting. And that's where we are with this. I don't think this is the best deck in the format. I think it's a fine deck, not one I would normally default to, but I thought for this tournament it might be the call. I'm not sure if it's going to work out that way, sadly, but I'm sure we'll get onto that. But I think this build of it certainly is very good. All
right, so we'll jump into the deck. Titanshift, name of the game, prime time, first card on the slide, obviously.
Yeah.
The namesake card, it does it all.
Yeah, I have a soft spot in my heart for this one. It's done a lot of good work for me over the course of the year. And it offers a unique effect in the deck compared to, we're going to see Hour of Promise in a future slide, which is basically just the enters the battlefield and attack trigger on this card for 1 mana less, and for 1 mana more, you get so much in addition. But in particular, this is a format where people are playing cards like Summon Denial, Force of Negation. They have ways to contain your ability to just spurt mountains onto the battlefield and produce lots of Valakut triggers. Sometimes you need to just have a 6/6 attacker, or you need to have a board presence that goes along with the lands you're trying to fetch. And so Titan is the perfect creature for the job. In previous lists, you see it alongside Summoner's Pact, and that's a card which, again, is very good in a more open format, where if you have an Obstinate Baloth in your deck or your sideboard, you have extra copies of that against burn, for instance, if you get paired against that. Or if you really need that Reclamation Sage that's in your sideboard, it's more virtual copies. For this tournament, though, I'm trying to keep things very narrow and very focused, so you have less virtual copies of Titan, but you have more cards that kind of replicate the same effect. And this deck here is built more for consistency than for versatility.
Right, we've got Tri-Builder here, going to be ramping. Explore, going to be ramping. Next slide, there will be more ramping. Farseek.
You're sensing a theme here. Yeah.
But talk about Hour of Promise specifically, and also the Colony Heart Expedition. This is a card that's always coming in and out of this deck, depending on where it's at in the meta, it feels like.
Yeah, and these go in tandem with the Prismatic Omens, which are not technically ramp, but achieve the same effect alongside Valakut, where you get triggers on the 6th land instead of the 7th, and because of the way that it makes all your lands mountains, now you play a fetch land and that's a mountain. So those cards in concert with each other give you a lot more permutations of draws that produce a turn 4 kill in some way. So you can do, for instance, turn 2 Expedition, turn 3 Omen, turn 4 Skatedrift for 4 Valakuts, sacrifice your Expedition, get 2 lands, and now you get 4 triggers for each of those, and that's 24. And that's without playing any of the actual ramp cards that are in the deck, which you have so many copies of, as you saw. And then Hour of Promise, this is a card that It gets a big upgrade from Field of the Dead in particular, where normally just casting this for Valakut and a mountain, let's say, that's maybe one trigger at best, which is not that impressive. When you get Field of the Dead, you get an immediate board presence, which then compounds on itself with every further land that you play. And we've seen that synergy used to great effect in Pioneer, to the point where Field of the Dead had to be banned.
Right.
So we're now just importing that to a larger format.
Right. You mentioned how this deck doesn't get a lot of new cards. Field of the Dead, though, one of the new cards that makes a huge impact in this deck, as well as Amulet. But here you get to search it up quite often and get the board presence and get the mountain thing going simultaneously.
Yeah, this build of the deck actually harkens back to something that Collins Mullen, fellow Players Championship competitor, had a lot of success with about 2.5 years ago when Hour of Devastation first came out. His idea was that if you just streamline the deck, you cut a lot of the interaction, a lot of the situational cards, and you focus on cramming as much ramp in of different sorts as possible, then you can achieve the same thing as having interaction, where instead of trying to pick off their thing and then build up, you just race them to the finish line, while also being more consistent against disruption. And those builds of the deck fell out of favor over time, but I thought for this tournament, where people aren't really trying to interact with you that much, this might be the best time to go back to that.
All right, we'll move on. We'll see the Prismatic Omen, as you mentioned, allows all these different ways to win quicker and through different means. Search for Tomorrow, more ramp, and then Scapeshift, the other namesake card. Casting this, you're trying to win the game.
Yeah, and previously there were certain breakpoints that you would memorize when you first become familiar with this deck. So getting a Valakut and 6 mountains is 18 damage, and then that scales up very dramatically when you have more Valakuts and so on and so forth. And then Field of the Dead adds that extra element where you can do the same thing that you saw in Standard, where you get Field and 6 differently named lands, and we'll see an array of those very shortly.
We're already getting flashbacks to Field of the Dead.
We're going to have to go through a lot of slides to get to the end of the lands portion here.
All right, so we'll get going there because we have the Veil of Summer's main deck.
Yes.
3 copies, and this is because you have your lightning bolts in the sideboard.
Yeah, this is a bold statement for this tournament. So looking at the field, I expected Lotus Box to mostly be on Urza, which that didn't age well, that call. I expected a decent amount of Death Shadow of various descriptions, maybe some interactive blue decks like the Stoneforge decks or things like that. And all of these are very weak to Veil of Summer. So this is a card that you absolutely want 4 copies of in the 75, and usually those start in the sideboard. You start your sideboard with 4 Veil of Summer. So I figured you have room for some interaction in the main deck, and Lightning Bolt right now, if you don't expect Devoted Druid, is not a great card. You know, it's not killing Urza, it's not good against Shadow or some of the other combo decks. So why not have your interaction be the card which you're most eager to sideboard in 80% of my projected breakdown for this tournament.
Right.
So even at its worse, it can sometimes be good. So against humans, for instance, you would much rather have Lightning Bolt, but sometimes this gets a Kaiser Freebooter trigger or stops them from bouncing something with Reflective Mage. So you can often find applications to where it at least cycles and finds a card that does something, even if it itself is not doing anything.
Right. Now we'll move into the lands. Obviously, Valakut there, the fetch lands here, then the Stomping Grounds. Now we'll get into the good ones. We got the different mountains.
Yeah.
We've got the Cinder Glades, the Sheltered Thickets, and then the utility coming up here between Castle and Field of the Dead. Talk about the Castle here, because we see this in both Amulet and this deck, just letting you do more early Titan stuff, basically.
This is a recent pickup, yeah. So in this deck, it can be awkward sometimes because it's not a mountain. It's a one-off. You can't search for it with any of your fetch lands or anything like that. Excuse me. But in the matchups where they have ways to interact with your ramp effects, your Farseeker is getting countered, let's say, or you just don't have time to do things. This is ramp that's baked into your mana base, where you're not spending a card on it. You're just naturally developing your lands, as you hope to do in every single game you play with the deck. And then sometimes it lets you cast a Titan ahead of schedule, and that can often be the difference between winning and losing the game.
Right. Actual mountains here, 3.
Yes.
And then we're going to see Snow-Covered Mountain. You got to keep your lands varied for the Field of the Dead. And this lets you do it with the Snowlands.
Yeah, usually Arkham's Astrolabe is to blame for stuff like this, forcing all of the sweet lands that people own out of the format to replace them with ugly snow-covered basics. But in this case, it's Field of the Dead that is, you can assign the blame for.
Yeah. All right, we'll move on. Now we're into the actual sideboard where the 1 Veil of Summer rests.
Yeah.
We have Choke, and then we have Damping Sphere here. What was your target for the Sphere?
Damping Sphere covers your bases against a lot of the other unfair decks. So Tron, Amulet Titan, big mana in general, but then also Storm if people are playing that. Just something that interacts on an axis which is not favorable to you, Damping Sphere is probably good against. So it's just a nice all-purpose hedge. Choke is, again, aggressively targeting these Urza decks, which are based around the Mythic Sanctuary loops with Cryptic Command and so on. And so their mana base is predominantly islands. So they're getting at most one use of all of those if you have Choke. It's a good way to prolong the game to the point where you can just overpower them eventually. And then the Veil of Summer making up the numbers from the 3 in the main deck.
I will get to the next page here. Anger of the God, this is your choice of sweeper. We have Relic as your graveyard hate, and then another Field of the Dead. This for control matchups, I assume, stuff like that.
Control, Shadow. Sometimes Field of the Dead is actually the game plan that you want to move towards instead of Valakut. So being able to Arrow of Promise or Primeval Titan for 2 Field of the Dead, generate this massive board presence immediately, and then just keep doing that every time you play a land is a better plan than, especially if they have life gain or they're not dealing too much damage to themselves. The first few Valakut triggers don't affect the game that much, whereas the first Field of the Dead trigger does, and then the second one and the third one and so on. So it adds up very quickly. Anger of the Gods was a hedge against some of the graveyard decks that I expected. I didn't know if people would pivot towards things like Dredge or Crabvine, because those decks, if the other decks aren't packing graveyard hate, might be a good way to get those. So the exile effects seem relevant. If you're more scared of humans and they're meddling mages, then you can mix this up with Fire Spell, Spuldering Suns, whatever you please. And same thing with Relic. It's hedge against graveyards. It's also good against Shadow and some of the control decks that rely on the graveyard.
Right, and then we'll see the lightning bolts here in the sideboard. 4 copies.
Yeah. These will be coming in a lot of the time, I imagine, in this field. Against any of the small creature decks, Devoted Druid, Infect, even things like Storm, which qualifies as that because they rely so much on Baral or Goblin Electromancer. This is the best piece of interaction you can ask for. It has been for 25 years now, and it continues to be here in 2019.
Right, so Titanshift, the name of the game. How did you end up on this deck, and what did you expect the field to be?
So my testing process for this event, as I said, I expected at least 40% of the room to be on Urza, if not more. I knew that Lotus Box had played the deck extensively, even as recently as a few weekends ago, still playing it to great success. I figured most of them, if not all of them, would stay on that deck. I know Harlan and Zach and Drake had all played Urza at some point in the past. Oliver had as well. Basically, everyone who's in the tournament would consider playing Urza, if not just defaulting to Urza. I wanted a deck that was good against Urza, and the way to do that is to be good against Oko, because that is an Urza deck, but it's really an Oko deck. It's the card that pushes that over the top. And Oko invalidates the text on so many cards that it's tough to find a way to do that. So you have to look for obscure things like enchantments that have an effect on the game, or if there's a planeswalker you can find that's good. But one way to do it is to just not play to the board and fight over the stack instead, or to, in this case, make a bunch of land drops, which Oko thankfully cannot interact with. So this deck doesn't really care about Oko, just because of its game text, and it also just races the Oko decks to the point where they can have an Elk, that's fine. You're going to be making Primeval Titan, casting Scapeshift. It's very tough for them to deal with that. And then their usual countermeasures to things like big mana, like Damping Sphere and so on, are just not effective against its deck. So I thought this would be a good way of sidestepping that. I had a bunch of different decks I wanted to try. I tried Amulet, I tried Tron, all the things that I've had success with in the past, and they just weren't beating Urza. And that was, that was a litmus test for this tournament. If you can't at least be competitive against Urza, then either play Urza yourself or find something else. Was very close to playing Urza myself. Perhaps should have just done that like many other people did. I figured this would be a good way to sidestep that while also beating up on Shadow, Eldrazi Tron, some of the other things that people might do to try and outlevel Urza at the same time.
All right, well, your first year on the SCG Tour converts into your first Players' Championship. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good. I'm trying to come into this tournament with no expectations, just have a good time with people that I've grown close to in many cases over the course of the year, grinding with them, competing against them. It's going to be a fun tournament to watch. I know all of you will put on a great show, so I'm just excited to be a part of it.
All right, Dom, get ready. It's going to be 3 days of action, hopefully. Thanks for joining me here in the sideboard. Stay tuned to Star City Games all weekend long for the action here in Roanoke.